Hey, Pastor Phil here. Here's another virtual expo, kind of an illustration to help us tackle the idea of sin. And sin is that concept that it's the things that we do that separates us from God, His relationship, His love. And it's one of those things that, are you going to talk about sin again? And maybe we don't talk about sin enough, but it's those things that the Ten Commandments and others kind of point us to say, yeah, you're the one that's moved away from in this relationship with God. And so shout out to Ethan Hemingway as I use some of his illustrations. It's a big deal. And we tend to qualify it in different ways. Like, I don't know, did I steal something? Did I have hatred in my heart as though it was murder against someone? And what those things are. And sometimes we stack up sin differently, whether you think that maybe gossip is worse than something else, or maybe you think that whatever, this is just a white lie, so maybe it's not a big deal. And this concept of sin, but James tells us that if, you've kept the whole law, I think it's James chapter 2 around verse 10, but at one point, if you're guilty of it, then you're guilty of breaking the whole law. The entire thing. So it's saying all sin is equal in God's eyes. It is anything that separates us from His grace, His mercy, His love, His ongoing compassion, His hesed, which is this loyal love that God sends to us. But we separate ourselves from the smallest of sins. And sometimes we stack that sin up. And sin sometimes looks to us like, looks like we deviate and say sin looks like not always black and white. There's a gray area. What does that sin look like? And we justify it in our own eyes. But sin is sin. It doesn't matter what it is. It's anything. The Ten Commandments help point us to the idea that we're all a big bag of mess of sin that separates us. And ultimately, we needed Jesus to come in and restore us. And in the same way that the one sin separates us from God, that if we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So the same way that we're all sinners, we can all become righteous through Jesus. And so here's where this illustration really helps us. We tend to think that sin is seen like this, like it's little sin, big sin, and of course sin has different consequences, right? I'm not saying that we don't have different compound consequences sometimes because of the things that we say, the things that we do, the sin against someone else versus even just hurting ourselves. So I'm not saying there isn't different consequences, but I'm saying when God looks from above at our sin, all sin is equal. Do you see it? Like, we tend to have this perspective straight on, but when God is looking at us from His heavenly perch, from His throne room, He's like, you keep separating yourself from me, but it's all equal in His sight. And maybe one way to illustrate that too is just like, we see this mountains of sin that we go up the mountain and down into the valley, up and down again. But when God looks at it, it's all equal, right? He sees it as a separation, as a divide from His presence to where we are. So sin is a separator. We tend to elevate it as a worse sin, but really what it is God's perspective in that, and you're right, there's different consequences to it that may have a longer life, and you may reach more people depending on what that sin is or trespass that you've done. But in God's eyes, I think it's 1 John, it says, for all of, we've all sinned, Romans says, and fall short of God's glory. But in 1 John, it's like this soap bar of cleansing us from our sins. If we say that we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves, and truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just or righteous to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness, because He sees it as equal, and He then breaks the divide where sin divides us, and we can be whole with Him again. hope this illustration helped a little bit to understand, yeah, there's consequences of a sin that aren't necessarily equal, but the separation itself, any sin, if we're guilty on one point, we're guilty of all of it. And so God sees us just as a separation.